Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode in my Node and JavaScript mini lessons kind of mini series, intermediate kind of series after the introduction to Node JS series, where we are covering some basic JavaScript lessons that are kind of important to just in general when you want to program in Node, and just are good things to know possibly even before you start writing Node.js. So these are just some miscellaneous topics that I thought are important. In this episode, we are going to be going over what are called arrow functions. Now, just as a quick prerequisite, you probably want to have already installed Node JS, like the actual way to run the Node code, which if you haven't seen that yet, I will leave a card in the top right to the first episode in my Introduction to Node JavaScript series, where I went over how to install Node JS. And then when you're done with that, you can come back here. So like I said, again, this episode is focusing on arrow functions, and I guess the first question to answer are, what are arrow functions? Now, in JavaScript, arrow functions are generally a way to replace traditional functions, and they offer a couple of different advantages, namely more kind of clean code, or it looks more concise, and also there's a whole thing about an implicit this, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So essentially, to answer this first question, arrow functions are just replacements for current normal functions. And what I mean by current normal functions is if you type in, for example, actually, I'm going to go ahead and remove this. This is from the last episode in Introduction to Node.js. If you type in function hello, and this is how you create a function in JavaScript. Again, if you're not aware of how to do this, then I recommend you check out my Introduction to JavaScript tutorial series where I talked about that. But so this is how you create a basic function. The same way you could create the exact same function using the arrow function syntax is you create a variable called const hello, and then you set it equal to an arrow function, which is just the parentheses, an arrow, and then this. They look somewhat similar, and I think the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Docs, explains it very well. So an arrow function is a compact alternative to a traditional function. It's limited and can't be used in all situations, but it can be used in almost every situation I've found. So just some differences. It doesn't have its own bindings to this, which if you are not aware of what this means, when you create a function, you can actually type something called this, and this will create a variable that lives inside the function only, and that kind of lives with the function. And this is for the sake of not getting too deep into it, this was essentially a keyword that can be used when before classes existed in JavaScript. And nowadays we have classes which make JavaScript more like a traditional object-oriented programming language. So this is kind of less useful nowadays, but basically functions have an implicit this. So if I type this, it's referring to the function. Whereas if I type this here, this is not right. This is incorrect syntax in an arrow function. So I will go ahead and keep reading here. Again, it does not have arguments or new target keywords, not suitable for a call, apply, and bind, cannot be used as constructors, cannot use yield within its body, although there are ways to await for async code. So a lot of these limitations are really not super of a big deal. They are really kind of just need to be noted, but for the most part, you can circumvent almost every one of these. So the way you create a traditional function is, like I said, you create a function like this. In an arrow function, you just remove the word function and then place an arrow between the parentheses and the brackets, which is this equal greater than sign. That's an arrow, and that is how you create an arrow function. It's as simple as that. So this is the basic syntax. And then, so again, like the advantages as stated here, what are the advantages? I found a little article that talks about it in a better way than I can explain. One, they are less verbose, meaning they are more concise. You can see const sum, it takes in two variables, a and b, and then it returns the a plus b, versus in order to make this in a traditional function, you have to say const sum is equal to function ab, return a plus b. This just looks a little bit more dense, and especially when you have really simple functions, all you need to do is basically write this kind of syntax, and it'll be very simple. And then this is just talking about the const this, and this is just going into kind of ES5 JavaScript, which is the old standard for JavaScript. that is not used as much as ES6, which is the new standard. And like it said here, the arrow function syntax is simply creating a parentheses, an arrow, and this. And it's generally preferred by a lot of developers. I see in almost every kind of piece of modern code that I'm working with at my work, or if I'm looking at someone else's code on the internet, almost always will they use this code. Unless if the article was made several years ago, then this code would instead look like const hello is equal to function, like this. But this is kind of old syntax, and it's generally not preferred by modern programmers, and even any programmer who used to write code like this will generally write it like this nowadays if they are still programming. So this is just the preferred syntax here. And sorry for saying the word this so much. It's just a kind of a habit, but this is our syntax. And then when we are looking at the questions, arrow functions replacing regular functions, again, I already went over that. You can just type this versus if you went const hello is equal to function, or if you also went function hello, these are very similar. The first one is always preferred, generally, or is generally preferred. And then what is a closure? So there's just a closure is just one way of writing a function that calls itself. And this is something that I ended up using in Puppeteer, which is why I want to cover it. A closure for our purposes in JavaScript just means a function that contains itself and does not modify any variables outside of itself. So for example, if I create a function, this is the syntax for an arrow function. You just do parentheses, an arrow, or parentheses, an arrow, and then brackets. And basically this is creating a function here, and I can console.log hello, for example. Now, if I run this code by typing in, by cding into our proper folder, and I go Node JS Minilessons 1, and if I type in node index.js, notice nothing will happen. It will just go and exit. And the reason why is this is just a function. It's not actually being called. So in order to create a closure, all you do is you wrap it in parentheses and then you call it like a regular function. And now as soon as I run this, this is kind of like a self-contained function that just runs itself. And we see this in Puppeteer and in a lot of web scraping when we write Node code. And all this is meaning is if I break it down like this, notice again, this is our function here. This is the syntax for an arrow function. And then all we're doing is we're wrapping it and calling it, just like we would say hello and then call it like that. Well, instead we just have the function and then we call it like that, if that makes sense. So that is basically what a closure is, and this is how to write an arrow function as a closure. So this was a fairly short video just aimed to give you a basic introduction to what arrow functions are and how to use them. If at any point you were confused, you can go back and rewatch, or I have linked the Mozilla Docs arrow functions kind of article in the description, which this goes into much more depth and detail about the specific differences and the use cases for arrow functions. So if you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications whenever I post new videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.